All right, welcome back. Let's jump right back into Pridi Banomyong's life, shall we? It's a wild ride, to say the least. Last time, if you remember, we talked about his big role in the 1932 Siamese Revolution. You know, the one that really shook things up, moving Siam away from absolute monarchy and toward a more constitutional system.
Yeah, Pridi was right in the thick of it. He even drafted the first constitution, which is why some folks call him the architect of the revolution, though I don't think he ever used that term himself.
Right, right. But being an architect of change doesn't mean you always get to, control the whole blueprint forever.
Right, or at all.
So today we're going to see how Pridi dealt with all the wartime chaos, political rivalries, and, there's a tragic mystery in there, too, that really cast a shadow over his later career.
It's a pretty intense period, for sure. A mix of incredible bravery and some real heartbreak. It shows just how complex Pridi was as a person. He really did dream of a different Thailand.
So where do we even begin with this part of Pridi's story?
Well, we're heading into World War II now. Thailand's caught in a tough spot, stuck between Japan's ambitions and the Allied forces. And this is where we run into Seri.
Seri.
Yeah, it was a secret organization Pridi put together to resist the Japanese occupation.
Seri, the Free Thai movement. Sounds like something straight out of a spy movie. We haven't really touched on the side of Pridi yet. What made him start this whole secret organization?
Well, think about it. Japan invades Thailand back in December 1941. The Thai government, led by Prime Minister Pavin at the time, decided to collaborate. But Pridi, he was completely against it. He thought Thailand should resist, and that's where Seri comes in.
So you have Pridi, this intellectual, this expert in law and government, suddenly jumping headfirst into the world of, secret missions and underground resistance. It's a pretty stark contrast.
Totally. And it shows how adaptable he was, how much he was willing to fight for what he believed in, even if it meant working in the shadows. Pridi was not the kind of guy to sit back and watch while his country's fate was being decided.
So how did Seri actually work? I mean, what kind of stuff were they doing?
Their main goal was to mess with the Japanese occupation from the inside. They gathered intel, sabotaged infrastructure, and even helped Allied POWs escape. Dangerous work, no doubt. It took a lot of guts and a whole network of people they could trust.
Wow. So Pridi goes from architect of a new Thailand to, the architect of a whole resistance movement working undercover. That's a pretty wild shift.
It really is. And it wasn't without risk either. In August 1944, Pridi had to escape Bangkok on a fishing boat, no less, to avoid being captured by the Japanese. Talk about a close call.
A fishing boat. That's intense.
Right. It shows how serious things were getting. But it also shows Pridi was thinking ahead. He knew Thailand couldn't fight Japan on its own. He needed help from the outside, specifically from the Allies.
So he's not just leading a resistance, he's building alliances on a global scale.
Exactly. Pridi traveled all the way to China and then to the United States, working his tail off to get support and recognition for Seri. He knew that winning this fight would take more than just bravery. They needed some serious strategic partnerships.
That's where his political skills really come into play. He's not just a revolutionary anymore. He's a diplomat, a strategist, working this complicated global chessboard.
Right. And we have to remember that while Pridi was trying to free Thailand from occupation, there was another big player in this story whose vision for Thailand was totally different. Like Phongpaichit, or Phabun, as most people know.
Oh yeah, Phabun, the other big name from the 1932 revolution. But their paths seemed to go in completely different directions after that.
Yeah, for sure. Both men played huge roles in the revolution, but their ideologies and what they wanted for Thailand, well, those just didn't line up in the end. Phabun, with his military background, leaned towards a more authoritarian and nationalistic style, while Pridi was always a champion for democracy.
Okay, so we have these two powerful figures, both shaping modern Thailand, but with totally different ideas about what that should look like. I'm guessing things were a little tense between them.
You could say that. Their rivalry pretty much defined Thai politics in this era, and it's all tied up with the tragic death of King Ananda Mahidol back in 1946.
The death of King Ananda, yeah. This is where things get really heartbreaking.
It's June 9th, 1946, and young King Ananda is found dead in his bedroom at the Grand Palace, a gunshot wound to the head. It was a huge shock, and the whole nation was thrown into mourning and confusion.
And Pridi, being the regent at the time, was suddenly in a really tough spot.
Absolutely. He was already facing opposition from Phabun and his supporters, and now, with the king's death under such mysterious circumstances, Pridi found himself right at the center of a massive controversy.
I bet Phabun was all too happy to use that to his advantage.
You bet. The king's death was like an earthquake in Thai politics, and it set the stage for a major showdown between Pridi and Phibun. The consequences of that showdown would echo for decades.
Wow. So we've got wartime intrigue, political rivalries, and a mysterious death that just throws everything into chaos. This is gripping.
And you're not the only one who thinks so. This period in Thai history is still fascinating to historians and anyone who's interested in how power, ambition, and ideology all get tangled up together.
Before we get into the investigations around King Ananda's death and what happened after, let's take a closer look at this rivalry between Pridi and Phibun. It feels like their different visions for Thailand really set the stage for all the drama that's about to unfold.
It really does. Their story tells us a lot about how Thailand was trying to figure out its place in a world that was changing so quickly.
Last time we were talking about Pridi Banomyong and how he was leading this super secretive Seri time movement against the Japanese during World War II. It's not something you hear about every day, but it's like super important to understanding this whole era.
It really is. And while Pridi's putting everything on the line to liberate Thailand, you've got his old rival, Phibun, steering the country in a whole other direction. You know, the way they approached governing and developing the nation, it was already causing some friction, and the war just made things worse.
It seems like it's more than just personal ambition between them,
Right.
like a fundamental disagreement about what Thailand should be.
Exactly. And if you look at their backgrounds, you can kind of see where that clash comes from. Pridi, with his academic background, spent years studying law and political science over in France. He was all about democratic principles, a strong parliament, individual liberties, that sort of thing.
So he's bringing a Western liberal perspective to Thai politics.
Right. And that was a big contrast to Phibun's vision. You know, Phibun came from a military background, and he was influenced by the rise of authoritarian regimes in Europe at the time. So he was focused on national unity, modernization through strong leadership, and a more centralized way of governing.
So you have these two major figures in Thai politics, both key players in the 1932 revolution that toppled the absolute monarchy, but now they're pulling in opposite directions.
It's a fascinating dynamic, right? They both wanted to modernize Thailand, but they had totally different ideas about how to do it, and it's that difference that led Pridi to oppose Phibun's decision to side with Japan during the war.
That decision must have been a real turning point for Pridi.
Oh, yeah. It solidified that ideological split between them and pushed Pridi to get more involved in the resistance. Remember, Pridi had helped write Thailand's first constitution, a document that was all about establishing a more democratic system. So seeing Phibun align with an imperial power like Japan, it must have felt like a complete betrayal of everything he stood for.
Yeah, it's also interesting, right? You have Pridi, this champion of democracy, working with allied powers like the U.S. and Britain. But these powers, while fighting against fascism, were also colonial powers themselves.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that history is rarely simple. Alliances often come out of necessity, even if it means working with people whose values don't totally align with your own. Pridi was trying to free Thailand, and to do that, he had to navigate these complicated waters of international politics.
It makes you wonder how much of his decision to work with the Allies was about really believing in their cause versus just needing allies against Japan.
It's a question historians still debate. But what's clear is that Pridi was a smart strategist. He knew Thailand couldn't defeat Japan alone. They needed powerful allies, and he was willing to go after them, even if it meant putting some of his own ideological preferences aside.
So while Phibun is consolidating his power in Thailand, Pridi's working behind the scenes, building this resistance movement and making international connections. It's a lot to juggle.
Yeah, it really shows Pridi's flexibility. He's not just a legal scholar, he's a political operator, a diplomat, a resistance leader. It's a side of him that doesn't always get the attention it deserves, especially with everything that happens after the war.
Which, of course, brings us to the tragic death of King Ananda Mahidol in 1946. That event throws everything into turmoil and has a huge impact on both Pridi and Phibun.
It's true. The king's death creates this vacuum, a moment of intense uncertainty. And as we know in politics, vacuums never stay empty for long. Someone always steps in to fill the void.
Right. Okay, so let's set the scene. Can you remind us about King Ananda and the circumstances of his death?
So King Ananda Mahidol, he becomes king when he's just 9 years old, but he spends most of his reign in Switzerland getting a Western education. He finally comes back to Thailand in 1945. It's a time when the nation's trying to recover from the war, and he represents this hope for a new beginning.
A young king, back in his homeland, ready to take on his royal duties. What went wrong?
Well, on the morning of June 9th, 1946, he's found dead in his bedroom in the Grand Palace. A single gunshot wound to the head.
Awful. And I'm assuming the details surrounding his death were suspicious right away.
Absolutely. No sign of forced entry. The gun that was used was the king's own, and the people who were at the palace that morning, their stories didn't match up. The whole nation was in shock. And because there was no clear explanation, well, the rumors and speculation just ran wild.
And Pridi, as regent, he's suddenly responsible for figuring out what happened.
Right. And you have to remember, some people in the military and the elite already didn't trust Pridi. His liberal views, his intellectualism, his connection to Seri Thai, it all made him an outsider in some circles.
So he was already in a vulnerable spot, even before the king's death.
Exactly. And then this shocking, unexplained event happens, and Pridi's the one who has to oversee the investigation. It was a recipe for disaster.
It sounds like things are about to boil over.
They were. The public wanted answers, the political stakes were sky high, and everyone was watching Pridi's every move. And don't forget about Pavin. He's waiting in the wings, and he's a master at manipulating situations to his advantage.
Pavin must have seen this as his chance to grab power.
He absolutely did. He started publicly criticizing how Pridi was handling the investigation, hinting that Pridi was either incompetent or, even worse, involved in the king's death.
Wow, that's a serious accusation. Did Pavin even offer an alternative explanation for what happened to King Ananda?
He did. He put forward this idea that the king accidentally shot himself while playing with a gun. But most people didn't buy it, even Phavin's own supporters.
So it seems like Phavin's goal wasn't really about giving a believable explanation. It was about creating doubt, making people question Pridi's credibility.
You got it. It was a classic power move, taking advantage of tragedy and uncertainty to his own benefit. Pavin knew that when things are chaotic, people want stability. They want someone who seems strong and in control. And he presented himself as that guy, the one who could provide that leadership.
And sadly for Pridi, it seems like it worked. Just a year later, Pavin stages his coup, right?
That's right. November 1947, Pavin, with the military backing him up, overthrows the government. Pridi's forced into exile.
So Pridi, the architect of the 1932 revolution, the man who fought for democracy and resisted the Japanese, he's ousted by his former ally. That's rough.
It really is. It's a harsh lesson in how fast things can change in politics. Pridi's fall from grace was swift, and it marked the beginning of a long period where the military had a lot of control in Thai politics.
And what about the mystery surrounding King Ananda's death? Was it ever solved?
It's a question that still haunts Thailand today. Officially, the case is unsolved. There have been tons of investigations, trials, inquiries over the years, but nobody's ever come up with a definitive answer.
So the mystery continues. A story with no real ending, no closure.
It really shows how history can be messy, full of unknowns, and often really unsettling.
Okay, so we've been talking about Pridi Banomyong and his, huge impact on modern Thailand. From those early days as a legal expert pushing for democratic changes to leading that secret Seri Thai movement during World War II, Pridi's story is full of bravery, strong beliefs, and, well, tragedy too.
Yeah, and like we've seen, his path is totally intertwined with his rival, Plague Phongpaichit, or Phaven. Phaven's authoritarian tendencies and political maneuvering, they really shaped Pridi's fate.
Right, and their rivalry wasn't just a clash of personalities like we talked about. It was about two completely different visions for what Thailand should be. But then the death of young King Ananda Mahidol in 46, that's what throws everything into chaos.
It's true. It's an event that's still shrouded in mystery. All those circumstances surrounding his death, they were suspicious from the get-go. And the investigations that followed, they just added to the confusion and controversy.
Okay, so let's get into those investigations. What can you tell us about the efforts to find out the truth about King Ananda's death?
Well, the first investigation, the one right after the king died, it got a lot of criticism. People said it was rushed, inconclusive. You can imagine the pressure. A young king dead under mysterious circumstances, a whole nation demanding answers, and a political climate that's already super tense.
Yeah, it sounds like a situation where someone could easily take advantage.
Exactly. And Phaven, he was a master at using situations like this to his advantage. He wasn't going to let this one slip by. He used the uncertainty around the king's death to his benefit. He'd publicly criticize how Pridi was handling the investigation, planting those seeds of doubt about Pridi's loyalty, and if he was even capable of doing the job.
So while the nation was grieving, the political battle was heating up.
Absolutely. And Pridi, being the regent, he was in a really vulnerable spot. Certain groups within the military and the elite already saw him as too liberal, too intellectual, too connected to the West.
And his role with Seri probably didn't help.
You're right. Those wartime actions, some people saw them as heroic, but others saw them as proof that he was working with the Allies, and they resented that.
So Pridi's trapped in this web of political intrigue. He's facing accusations from Pavin and his crew while trying to lead a country that's deeply divided. What happened next?
Well, they launched a second investigation. This time, it was led by a new police chief, someone who was completely on Pavin's side. And this investigation, it took a hard turn. They decided to focus all their attention on Pridi.
So they turned the investigation into a weapon against him.
Exactly. They went after every aspect of Pridi's life, trying to find anything at all to connect him to the king's death. They questioned his friends and associates. They went through his personal letters, even analyzed his handwriting. It was a full-on campaign to destroy his reputation.
Did they actually find anything solid to back up their accusations?
Nope. The evidence they came up with was mostly circumstantial. They relied a lot on what a few witnesses said, but some of those witnesses, well, their motives were questionable, and some even took back what they said later on.
So this second investigation, it sounds like it wasn't really about finding the truth. It was about getting rid of a political rival.
A lot of historians agree with that assessment. They say the whole investigation was manipulated to help Pavin gain power. They created a story that would justify him taking over.
How did Pridi respond to all this?
He always said he was innocent, said he was the victim of a political witch hunt. He pointed to the lack of real evidence and how unreliable the testimonies were.
But it seems like Pavin's plan was working. Public opinion was split, and Pridi's reputation had taken a hit.
Yeah. Pavin was good at propaganda. He knew how to tap into people's fears and anxieties. He presented himself as the strong leader who was needed in a time of crisis. And the king's death, as tragic as it was, gave him the perfect chance to solidify his power.
Which leads us to the 1947 coup.
Right. Pavin used all the uncertainty and instability surrounding the king's death to justify his takeover. He said he was doing it to restore order, to keep the country from falling apart.
And Pridi, he knew he was in danger, so he decided to leave Thailand.
It must have been a difficult choice for a man who dedicated his life to his country. He knew if he stayed, he'd probably end up in prison, or worse.
So he goes into exile, leaving behind everything he built.
Yeah, he spent the rest of his life abroad, first in Singapore, then China, then finally France. Never came back to Thailand. But he never stopped writing, never stopped advocating for his beliefs. He never gave up hope that his homeland would have a more democratic future.
It's a sad ending to an incredible life. A man who played such a key role in shaping modern Thailand, forced out by the very forces he helped create.
It's a reminder that democracy is fragile, political ambition is powerful, and sometimes history takes unexpected turns.
And after all this time, the mystery of King Ananda's death remains.
It does. Officially, it's still unsolved. Over the years, there have been many attempts to re-examine the evidence and figure out what really happened, but no one has ever come up with a definitive answer.
It's a case that continues to fascinate and make people wonder. What really went down that night in the Grand Palace? Who was responsible? And what if things had gone differently? How would Thai history have unfolded? It's a lot to ponder. And on that note, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive into the life of Pridi Banomyong. It's a story full of twists and turns, reminding us that history is rarely simple. Thanks for joining us.